It is truly an honor and a privilege to be what I consider back home in a way. I don't know if many of you have met me before, but I used to be a consultant with the patent system, and so a lot of my patent family are in the space, so I'm really happy to reconnect with all of them and see some other familiar faces in previous work that I've done. So again, just very honored and privileged to be here with all of you. And so part of what I hope to talk about today is really what is the true story? And you may say, okay, where are we going with this? When we talk about data, and that's sometimes a four-letter word for some of us, the data is something that, as my good friend and colleague, Dr. Peterson, who's in the back, I'm gonna shout him out the way he did me earlier, it's important for us to know about. And it's the only way we're gonna be able to be true and authentic to how our systems are functioning, right? And so my hope today is to take you through the process of not only knowing your data on a large scale aggregate, but what does it mean when you drill down and disaggregate? I'm gonna take a poll really quickly and ask you, how many of you have disaggregated your data before? Fantastic, okay. So as part of that process, some of this may sound familiar, for others it may be new, but in this session, what I'm hoping to accomplish is to give you some strategies and skills as you do disaggregate your data to analyze what it really means and what actions you can take as a result. And I always love this answer because it's always giving me the best time. Okay, so before we get started, I like to warm people up. I hate the term icebreaker, because that normally makes people flinch. So I'm gonna say a warm up. So to begin this process, what I'd like for us to do is think of a song that comes to mind that either puts you in the space of how you're feeling today or something that describes how you are viewing the world at this moment. So while you're thinking of that song, I'm going to give you my examples. Right there on the left-hand side is Marvin Gaye. How many of you are familiar with Marvin Gaye? Okay, you're going to date yourselves a little bit. That's okay. So Marvin was a premier superstar in what was called the Motown sound. So 50s, 60s, all the way up till now, Motown has been a premier record company, particularly in the African-American Black community. And Marvin Gaye was one of those premier singer-songwriters that always had a pulse on what was going on at the time, and hence he wrote the song, What's Going On? He wrote it in 1971, and I guarantee you, if you were to put this song on right now, you would be like, wow, Marvin is sitting right here next to me. Because the lyrics still talk about, brother, brother, there's way too many of you dying, right? He's hitting on the climate and the culture that he was existing in, and sadly, we haven't gotten that far. 1971. The other person that you see in the top right is my all-time favorite, Janet Jackson. I try to channel her whenever I'm standing in front of a group and just say, what would Janet do? And so Janet Jackson wrote a song called Rhythm Nation in 1989. Now I'm dating myself for our 80s, 90s babies in the room. But that song for me is the equivalent of what's going on to my mom and my dad. And so those are my two examples, and I would love to hear some voices, and I know, do we have another microphone if anybody minds running it? Thanks, Eva. I'd love to hear your examples. So wait for the microphone because we are recording. So please feel free to raise your hand, and Dr. Allen will come with the mic to share your song, or if you shout it out, I'll repeat it. How about that?
I put my running shoes on for this.
Oh, you got one in the back. Go ahead. Run, run, run.
Don't trip. Don't fall.
No, we definitely don't want you to trip.
I always think about Man in the Mirror by Michael Jackson.
I didn't say this, but I'm more of a Michael fan than Janet. Don't tell her. But anything Michael Jackson, I'm in love with. And that song is, again, you could play it right now, and it still has the same impact. Thank you for that. Thank you for putting me in my Jackson space.
Mine was Under Pressure with Queen and David Bowie.
Under Pressure. Yes, that's a good one. Okay, I'm going to test you while Eva's getting the mic. Who did a variation of that with the same beat? Come on, 90s babies.
Vanilla Ice.
Vanilla Ice, come on. Oh, you knew that. Okay.
I was going to go with Ball of Confusion by the Temptations.
I love it. That's a Motown one, too. Yes.
Don't Stop Believing by Journey.
Don't stop. Yes, good job. Anything else before we dive in? Oh, we got one up. Okay, yep, and then one more up front. Uh-oh.
Oh, I think I have a block.
She got blocked by that. She's coming.
I think everyone's making
I
sure
can
I get my
repeat it.
steps in.
That's okay, Eva. I got it. Go ahead. I Will Survive, Gloria Gaynor, disco era, and still very much relevant. So I feel like we're warmed up because when we talk about data, and Dr. Peterson and I both joke that it's dry. It's dry to talk about data, but we try to zhuzh it up a little bit so that people can connect to the importance and the value of data. Okay, so who am I? I gave you a little taste of that, again, liking to introduce myself in a way that connects us. So now I have some faces and names with certain songs. So now when I see you out, I will be like, yep, Man in the Mirror. Yep, I Will Survive. Yep, Journey. So who am I? I'm an educational consultant and strategist for Holland Sims Consultation. I took a big leap of faith. I'm being transparent with all of you and decided I want to do this my way. And so April of 2023, I took that leap and I haven't looked back. And so I'm just thankful for opportunities like this to stand in front of you. I was the Pennsylvania School Psychologist of the Year in 2021, and that was a major accomplishment. Very excited to share that again with Dr. Peterson as an alum of being a PA School Psych of the Year. He's also our national one right now. You should shout him out for that too. It's always good to have PA representing. The fun part for me, I am a wife to Ron. We will have an anniversary in November for 7 years. How many have made it 7 years or more? Oh, thank God. Okay, it's possible. All right, so I am a mommy to CJ. CJ is 6. He literally turned 6 last week, and he is in kindergarten. And so my prior life to CJ, I really cared about education. My post life with CJ, I doubled down on caring a lot about education. It changed me in a way that is indescribable. It also reinforces why we have to talk about things like this, because the data, while it can feel dry and it feels like just numbers sometimes, they're actual humans behind those numbers. And so that's the purpose that drives me. I'm a puppy parent to Biscuit. If you have any golden doodle parents in the house, I am one. He will be 3 in April and has totally turned our house upside down, but nevertheless, that's our family. I'm an IUP and Millersville alum. Any IUP folks in the room? Beautiful. Any Millersville folks in the room? Yes. Okay, fantastic. I'm a former cheerleader, as if you couldn't tell. And who did I want to be when I grow up? Janet Jackson. Who do I still want to be when I grow up? Janet Jackson. She is almost 57, I think, and can still move like she's 27. So I want to be able to do that too. And I'm a Disney fanatic. In other sessions that I train on, I try to insert Disney wherever I can. Unfortunately, this topic didn't lend itself to it, but I will try to find a way. If you catch it, let me know. Okay, so let's open the book. Remember I said, what's the true story? That's the title of our session today. So we're going to take you through 4 chapters. And in those 4 chapters, I want us to really be thinking about our own context, our own access to data, the conversations that you hear about data, and what it is you want to do as a result of knowing better to do better. Okay. I'm just not going to bother. All right. So in chapter 1, what essentially is the data we're referring to? It's the boots on the ground data. How many of you are teachers? Right. So you get the first look, if you will, at the data in your classrooms. You can pretty much pinpoint some things that come to you as a result of the performance of your students, the climate of your classrooms, and develop some insights on how you can move forward and how to make your classroom function in a positive way, right? That's the first layer. I'm a systems level thinker. I know many of us in here are. So at that classroom level, we do one part of this data review, and then we take it up to maybe the grade level, and then we take it up to the building level, district level, et cetera. The data is always going to drive what we do. With that, though, we can't just look at the data and say, oh, okay. There have to be goals that are connected to the data that help us guide and provide us a map to best practice. One of the things that I'm going to talk about today is related to disaggregating data. And the hallmark of disaggregating data is to ensure that we are providing equitable practices across each one of our systems. If you're not familiar with this infographic, it was developed in 2021 by our Pennsylvania Department of Education. If you would simply Google equity, inclusion, and belonging in PDE, it will pop right up. I used to work there. That's the easiest way to get to it because that website can be quite challenging to navigate. So if you're looking for it, that's the best way to access it. What we offered in this infographic and why I'm spending time here is because when people say the term equitable practices or equity, inclusion, belonging, there's a lot of noise around those terms, particularly as it relates to education. What I want us to do is be very much grounded in how we articulate and define what equity means for us in our context. Let me be clear. When we talk about equity, we're not just talking about race and ethnicity. So if your school looks like every child looks the same, for instance, you still need equitable practices. Why? Because you still have students who have an IEP. You still have students who may be unhoused. You still have students who may be children of incarcerated parents, and some of those things are connected across that one student's identity. So equitable practices are primary to how we can ensure every learner gets what they need to be successful. I'm gonna put a pause right here to tell you a quick story. Last week, I was in Chicago, and thankfully Harrisburg has a direct flight from here to Chicago, and I'm just gonna be transparent with all of you. Hopefully you won't judge me too much. When I'm on the plane, I don't want to talk to people I don't know, just being honest. And so the gentleman sits down next to me, and I try to put in my AirPods real quick, like, don't talk to me. And before I could get it out, he's like, so what do you do? And I'm like, okay, here we go, let's go. So I start telling him that I'm in education. I start saying, you know, I work in what's called positive behavior interventions and supports, PBIS. And he goes, you're trying to fix the schools? I'm trying. It's tough, but I'm trying. And this framework helps us to do that. And he starts saying, well, I want you to know how I would fix education. And he proceeds to tell me. And so the first thing he said is, I would get rid of preschool and early learning. Okay, so that gave me an indicator, okay? And so I'm like, I can't go anywhere. I'm stuck on this plane. I can't change seats. So, and I wanted to listen to him because part of what I train on is belonging and dignity. And so to honor his humanness as someone who has dignity, I said, let me hear him out. And so he said that. And then he goes, and you know, that equity stuff, and I'm like, oh, Lord, here we go. That equity stuff, I don't believe in any of that. Now, I have to really center myself now, right? Because this is my thing. This is my passion. He goes, because equity should be that every kid gets, or no, equality should be that everyone gets what they need to be successful. And this equity stuff gives everyone the same thing. And I went, wow. That's so interesting you say that because I was always understanding that it was the flip. And he was like, because I do believe that every child should get what they need to be successful. I said, guess what? We are on the same page. I'm saying all of that to say the messaging and the noise around these terms creates misunderstanding that if you can simply have a conversation, sometimes you can help someone better understand, not convert them. I'm not in the business of trying to convert you to anything. You either believe or you don't. But at least provide some understanding so that when they talk about this, they're better informed. That's what this was for. So I share that story to really anchor us in how important it is to know what is equity, what is inclusion, what does belonging mean. On the far right-hand, or left-hand side rather, that box that says it's hard to see, perception is the first box and then clarity is the second. That's the example that I just provided you. The perception that's in the field or in the country, whomever, and what is the clarity that I can responsibly provide to help that person make an informed decision. And that's why this is important. I've heard from school districts, superintendents, that they've used this with their school boards who are struggling when people are showing up saying, we don't want to do that equity stuff. Don't do that. A deeper understanding on what it really means to be equitable and the value of disaggregating data to tell us whether or not we're equitable or not. That's the value of it. Another thing that I want to offer as a tool and a resource is what's called the Equitable Practices Hub. If you've not seen that, in addition to the infographic I just shared, if you simply Google equity, inclusion, and belonging at PDE, it will take you directly to that hub. Now, what I'm showing you is like a flyer for it, but when you go to the actual website, it was intentionally designed to hopefully help any user access resources dedicated to their role. So for instance, it's hard to see, but in the middle at the bottom, it says equity spheres and it says classroom. So I saw a lot of teachers raise their hand. The classroom sphere is the sphere for you, right? Doesn't mean you can't go to any other sphere, but this one's dedicated to you as classroom teachers and gives you resources that align to those 6 pillars of practice. And what my hope is today is to take you through a couple of those pillars and connect why disaggregating data is so valuable to those pillars of practice to create equitable environments. So the first one that we're going to talk about is the general equity practices pillar. What does general equity practices mean? So I've listed a couple things, examples of what those practices could look like, feel like, and sound like in your particular context. So one would be policies. And you may not know this, but I'm going to poll the room. How many of you know that you have a board-approved equity policy in your district? Wonderful. Okay, that's super cool to see because I've trained in other places and the numbers are a little fewer than what we see today. Those policies drive practice, right? So if the policy is there, the hope would be that we have something we can rely on when we put certain practices in place to say that we're within our scope because the policy is dictating that we do it. Hiring practices. One of the major priorities nationally is around increasing the teacher workforce, just in general. In addition to that, we want to also increase and diversify the educator pipeline, whether that is teacher, para, school psychologist, school counselor, school social worker, so that students see themselves in these professionals and see that this is a viable career. It's indicated through research that when students actually have a teacher that looks like them, their achievement tends to go up, believe it or not. It's those little small things that make a difference, but we're struggling to get teachers in general in Pennsylvania. So how do we intentionally not only bring in a diverse group of professionals, but also professionals that want to be educators to begin with? And it's a tough world out there. I'm sure you can tell me a lot of stories about what you're having to navigate and how do we attract people to the field. We also need to adopt those system frameworks. You're here because of that. Multi-tiered systems of support is the vehicle for equitable practices. Why? Because it provides the framework for students to get what they need to be successful at the right time. Only frameworks like MTSS/PBIS are able to do that. We also need to evaluate our systems as a whole, so that may be an auditing process. And I don't know if many of you have participated in that, but a lot of school districts, I would say in the fall of 2020, really wanted to audit where things were from an equity standpoint. Did they always do the right thing as a result of what was found? Not always, but they were at least willing to try. And so it's how do we swing this pendulum back to get districts to say, let's go under the hood and let's really look at what we're doing well, what we could enhance, and what we need to stop altogether. We also need to start the equity journey, and that often begins with that audit that says, this is where you need to really focus, and then begin the process, whether that is self-awareness, understanding who we are, how we show up, et cetera. All of those things are the beginning of the journey. And then this last part, prevention, response, and recovery. Why is that there? Because I hate to say this out loud, it's not a matter of if you'll have an incident at your school related to bias, related to something that makes national news. It's a matter of when. The climate that we're in, hence the songs that I showed at the beginning, purposefully, we are in a hot button era where everything is under a microscope and anything can go viral and create an atmosphere in your schools that is highly uncomfortable and, quite frankly, harmful. There was a school, and I won't name it, but in Pennsylvania, how I even got really entrenched in this work at the state level was the post-2016 election. So right after the election, literally the day after the election, we know how we were feeling that day. Some of us were excited, jubilant, others were devastated. That wasn't absent in the schools, right? There was a school where the students who were excited about the outcome walked down the halls of their building shouting white power, telling students they were sending them back to Mexico, all types of things. What they didn't know is someone was recording them. And they sent that to whomever, and it went viral to the point that it made national news. The attention that that school garnered, those principals, those administrators were overwhelmed, to say the least, as to what to do, because what happened as a result, media attention, different groups showing up at their school, et cetera, you had another group who were essentially the people in receipt of what happened, who said, we're going to stage a protest if you don't handle this the way we want it handled. So now administrator is sitting in the middle of this and trying to figure it out. As a result of that, and I'm fast forwarding it for sake of time, but as a result of that, what came of that was the PDE Equity and Inclusion Toolkit. And it was broken down into those three categories of prevention, response, and recovery. Again, you can find that on the website as well. When I went to that school, because it's so interesting, they said we were dispatched. And that's just kind of the language and terms that are being used with this work. And I remember they said, we're going to send a school psychologist trained in trauma to go there. And I was like, am I? Okay. Okay. So I went, and it was just so interesting because that school psychology hat did have to get activated to think about all of the other systems, not just that immediate part, but what was the rest of their data saying? Has this been an ongoing thing and it just happened to hit the news this time? And that's what we found out. And so prevention became important, that this doesn't happen again. And how can we do better? We got to look at the data. Okay, so I'm not going to belabor. I've really kind of talked this one out. But how do we address systems with general equity practices? We have to understand the history. There's a great framework by Dr. Ronald Whitaker called HELP, H-E-L-P. The H is history. He says when we're doing equitable practices, and I often say the HELP framework can overlay your MTSS framework, the history part is critical. You have to know your history so that you're not, what? Doomed to repeat it, right? So the history doesn't just mean like what happened in 1776, globally or nationally. What's the history of your school? What's the history of your district? What worked before? What didn't work before? And if we don't know it, we might just be doomed to repeat it. So that H is so critical, the history. I'll give you the rest of the letters because when I train it, I sometimes forget to do that and people ask me. So really quickly, the E is equality versus equity. So think of Nicole on the plane being trapped and having this conversation about what is equality versus equity. The L is love. And I don't mean like my husband and I love. I'm talking about relationships, care, that love. And then P is pedagogy and practices. And often what Dr. Whitaker says is, as educators, we want to skip all that other stuff, the H, the E, and the L, and just get the checklist to tell me what to do. Tell me what practices I need to put in place right now, because this needs to happen right now. The urgency is there. We got to take a pause and go slow to go fast and look at all of those other components. And that's how general equity practices can really be articulated, because if we're following that pathway, we'll be able to embed those practices in everything that we do. Okay, let's do a system check. So I'm assuming you are here because you wanted to know about MTSS and PBIS at this conference. And I often find that it feels like a lot of Wizard of Oz lingo. Like, what is MTSS, PBIS, EIB? Oh my. There's so many different terms that are out there, and I want to normalize that, but also simplify it as much as possible. What I'm going to do, and I'll do it in a moment, is put the two together. So if you hear me say MTSS, please know I'm referencing as well PBIS, because MTSS is that overarching umbrella that encompasses the behavior side of the triangle, the academic side, and the base of social emotional wellness. Okay? So if you hear me use it, just know I'm referencing both. The EIB is equity, inclusion, belonging. Those three that you saw in that colorful infographic. Why do we have to talk about educational frameworks that are equitable? There's a good friend and colleague to Pennsylvania, Dr. Kamante Heidelberg. And Dr. Heidelberg, in his research around PBIS as a framework, said that research has supported the use of a tiered framework for behavior to improve school climate and reduce problem behaviors. Right? We all know that. We know that it works. However, although this is encouraging, there still remain students of varying backgrounds who are not benefiting from the standard implementation of a tiered framework. What does that mean to us? It means that even though we may have gotten a banner, I'm going to speak a little harsh, you still may not be fully implementing the way you need to. And it's not that you're not trying. You got the banner to motivate you to continue to do the good work and to continuously enhance the work that you do, so that this is not the case. So that every learner in your atmosphere is having an experience that creates belonging for them, connection for them. And unfortunately, nationally, things even like PBIS aren't doing that. And so that's why we have to start centering equity in what we do. I've already said that I'm going to use multi-tiered systems of support as sort of the anchor term, but I do want to give you this definition. It's a proactive and preventative framework that integrates data and instruction to maximize student achievement and support students' social, emotional, and behavior needs from a strengths-based perspective. Do not miss that last part, right? Strengths-based is so critical. We can't help ourselves. Sometimes we fall into the deficit mind trap quite easily. It's hard not to, but as much as we can, how can we reframe to get to strengths-based? I'm going to give a moment because I see some phones up to take pictures. And you can always just stop me if you need me to hold on. Okay, key components of a tiered system. This may or may not look familiar to you, but this comes from our friends at Patton, articulating essentially what MTSS is at the elementary level and the secondary level. I'm going to be quite honest, and it's not because I'm biased of knowing my Patton friends. There are not many states in our nation that have delineated the elementary and secondary triangle, framework, depiction, et cetera. Pennsylvania is a front runner in that effort because I know, and you know, Secondary can be a little bit different than elementary. I used to work in a middle school. How many middle school educators are here? Bless your hearts. I love you guys. We're special. We're so special. We're unique. Let me put it that way. We're unique. And so elementary things, sometimes for middle school staff that I've worked with, they tune out. That doesn't apply to us. It's not like that at the middle school. And then high school's a totally different group, right? They're also like, middle school doesn't understand us, elementary doesn't understand us. And so thankful that Patton's recognizing that and trying to create some cohesion, but also being aware that there are some differences. Some things, though, that are remaining very consistent across the K-12 band is that standards-aligned core instruction, universal screening. And I have to shout out Dr. Laura Moran, who's in the house, because when we talk about secondary work, universal screening may not look like Acadians, right? It may look like your early warning system. The attendance, behavior, and course performance indicators that can give you sort of a snapshot of the groups of students that may need a little bit more support in that particular area. Shared ownership, that's one of my favorites. Why? Because when I can recall working in a school, often if I got an evaluation, let's say, the teacher might say to me, you know, I really don't interact too much with kid whoever because they belong to Mrs. So-and-so, the ESL teacher. Shared ownership would say, it's not about the kid belonging to one other person, related service. It's about the kid belonging to each of us and us pouring into that student with our own respective skill sets and values and expectations. Shared ownership would say that. That's a mindset shift in a lot of schools, right? Database decision-making, that's what I want to spend the bulk of my time on, so I won't spend time here. Family and community engagement. There's a great colleague, Dr. Heather Bennett, who used to work for the Pennsylvania School Boards Association, and she said that if we are looking to develop any type of equity policy, I saw your hands go up for equity policies, if you are creating that policy without a family or community member at the table, it's not a real equity policy. Why? Because how can you know who you're serving if the voice hasn't been leveraged to inform the policy you're developing? You have to have them at the table. And then lastly, professional learning. You're here today. That's a prime example. That consistent coaching, job-embedded coaching to help you get better. It is so nice to think about, let's say we're basketball players. The coach isn't out there dunking the ball, right? The coach is on the side making sure that I have the skills I need to go out there and dunk the ball. And then when I come back and let's say I'm almost about to foul out, that coach is going to give me strategies to make sure I don't do that. That's what professional learning is offering to us. That coaching, that ability to get kind of refreshed, to get better as we inform our practice. I love this graphic. I just really wanted you to see it. Journey is the word for MTSS, right? There's research that says that implementation may take between 2 to 4 years. Let's now toss in principal turnover. Principal leaves. Guess what it ramps up to? 7 to 10. You, as the people who are implementing, have to be able to carry a torch when that leader goes away. The shelf life of a superintendent used to be 5 years. It's much lower now. And superintendents tend to drive the vision of the district and where they want to go. But you got to build capacity in the rest of your team so that when you go, the work doesn't die as a result. And so this implementation not being an event, you almost see the infinity symbol sort of behind it, shows that we're constantly going back and forth through exploration. Is this something we want to do? Installation, let's try it. Let's pilot it with a few things or a few places. Putting that in place initially and then fully implementing and realizing, I'm talking to my folks that earn banners. You may be at Fidelity at Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 1, 2, and 3. If you are, shout out to you. There are not a lot of us in Pennsylvania that are able, and I'll say nationally, to get all 3 tiers to Fidelity. but there's still probably something you can improve. And that's that growth mindset that we need to have when implementing. So I just wanted you to be aware of that as you're selecting frameworks. I've already talked about what is equity. I won't belabor it, but I want you to have this definition pretty clear in your mind. When we think about this in a very, easy way of interpreting it, I like to use my husband. My husband is a Jordan head. Any sneakerheads in the room? Okay, good, because if you were, he would want to know who you are. But anyway, he loves to wear Jordan sneakers, and they've been out since the 80s, but anytime they're re-released, he needs to be there to have them. I don't understand it, I never will, but it's okay. My point is, he wears a size 12 shoe. I do not. And so, if he tries to put me in his size 12 shoe, I'm gonna fall all over the room, because that size doesn't fit me. So equality would say a one size fits all, and equity would say I get the shoe size that fits me appropriately. That's the nutshell definition. But I want you to have this one. This is what PDE has adopted since 2018. It came from a national organization that brings together secretaries of ed, commissioners of education, et cetera, and they came up with this. The red and opportunity was added by yours truly because it just didn't say the right thing. So I'm going to unpack why. Ensuring that every learner has access. Beautiful. That's important. Let's come back to and opportunity, but has access to the educational resources and rigor they need at the right moment in their education across, and there's a multitude of identities listed there: race, gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, family background, etc. The and opportunity was added because access is simply not enough. And why I'm saying that in a disaggregated data session is because sometimes we think because we gave access and when we disaggregate the data, we still see disproportionality, is because the opportunity was missed. What do I mean by that? Let's go in a time machine. Let's go back to March 13th, 2020. Remember that day? I remember that day vividly. Governor Wolf got on and said, guess what, educators? School's done, shutting it down. And a lot of schools, I would say 98% of the schools in our Commonwealth, literally pivoted and mobilized and got devices into the hands of students, made sure they had them, made sure they could participate as best they could. This was the part. They didn't count for the deserts that exist in Pennsylvania that we call Wi-Fi deserts. So even though you gave them access, the opportunity for them to participate and connect to the learning was missing. What did they do? Because we have resilient people out there. They went to McDonald's parking lot. They went to the church parking lot. They went to a friend's house to get that Wi-Fi, to get that opportunity. That example illustrates why equitable practices are not just about race, gender, ethnicity, culture. It's for all of us, and it's how we contextualize it that makes the difference. And that right moment is multi-tiered systems of support, because your data will tell you where a student should receive support. That's the tiered structure. Okay. For sake of time, I'm going to keep moving, but where are we? Remember that H in history? I've talked about this a little bit, how important it is for you to kind of know where all of this work has come from, disproportionality in particular, why we have to, talk about it. It comes from this history lesson that begins as early as 1954 with Brown v. Board of Education. I'm hopeful that you're aware of that court case, and if you're not, just a brief synopsis, it was the desegregation of schools. If I had more time, we could spend a whole day talking about that one court case and the ramifications of that one court case. Remember earlier I said that we don't have a lot of teachers of color? Brown v. Board had an influential impact on that. It was a good thing, don't get me wrong, but when we desegregated, a lot of teachers of color lost their job because they were not seen as equal to the teachers that were already teaching white students. And it's had damning effects on us being able to recruit and retain. Again, we could spend a lot of time there. I'm going to get off that soapbox. Okay, disproportionality. The discipline practices happen across a multitude of identities as well. Gender, we often see more boys being referred and receiving disciplinary infraction. Socioeconomic status, race, obviously, we have a lot that points us towards certain races having disproportionate outcomes. Let me put this pin in here real quick. This does not mean that students of color misbehave more. It means that the disciplinary infractions that are doled out are increased for them. And if you were in Dr. Peterson's session, he articulated that in a phenomenal way. And I'm going to use your example if you're okay, because you're here and you can say yes or no. So he said if there are 5 students in a cafeteria, one of them happens to be black, and they're all acting out, and yet the black student is the only one that goes to the office, that's how we get this. And you may say, Nicole, well, why? Why is that? Well, let's say as a teacher, and I'm going to be honest with all of you, doesn't matter what color the teacher is. Let's just be clear. If I have a bias against something, I'm going to lean into that bias when I'm triggered by the behavior. So if it's the eye roll, if it's the who are you talking to from a student to me, and I've been taught and ingrained that that's disrespectful, I'm going to react, and my reaction is going to be probably more severe than it needs to be. But that's going to lead to disproportionality. There are many other examples that we can unpack, but for sake of time, I'm going to keep moving. Ability status, sexual orientation, special education placement, our IEP students. That's why the government dings us for disproportionality with students with IEPs on identification, on placement, and discipline. Because those students tend to be highly impacted by our decision making. And then gifted placement. We know the old adage, if we're not engaging students, behaviors tend to increase. And unfortunately, a lot of our gifted and talented students aren't feeling challenged enough. And in some classrooms, that manifests into behavior. Okay, disproportionality is complex. You may have trouble seeing that, so I'm going to unpack a few of them. Disciplinary policies and practices, so zero tolerance tends to be one of those policies that can really uptick disproportionality. Interventions and referrals, who's receiving interventions, who's not, who's being referred. Instruction and assessment are our most highly qualified staff in front of our neediest students. And also, how are we assessing? Let me give you a school psych example very briefly. I'm going to date myself a little bit, but I used to give what was called the WISC-4. That's an IQ measure. There was a test, a subtest, on that particular measure called What's Missing. And you would ask the student to look at a picture and identify to you what was missing in the picture, and then you'd score it based on that response. This is now an old test, so I can share it. In the What's Missing, I flip the page. This is a second grader. I flip it. It's 2008, and it's a picture of a rotary phone. Okay, thank you. You got where I'm going. All right. So it's the picture of a rotary phone in 2008. And I say, what's missing? And the student looks at me and goes, I've never seen that before. What is that? I can't tell them because now I'm going to break standardization. So I go, give me your best guess. I don't know. What was missing for those in the room that remember a rotary phone? It was the cord between the receiver, okay, and the phone. But they'd never seen that because guess what we had by then? iPhones, Blackberries, whatever you use, Androids, I'm not leaving you out. They had that. So I had to score that a 0. That impacted the overall score for that young person simply because she had not been exposed to a test that was not even normed for her. That's how assessment can contribute. Educational opportunity, we've talked about that. Family and community, we've also discussed that. Teacher expectations and misconceptions. I've touched on it a little bit. That's that inherent bias each of us has. So really quick story. Again, I like to tell stories because I hope it can connect for you a little better than dry data stuff. But recently I was at a high school, not even a high school, a district training administrators from every school in that district. It was the late afternoon, 3:30. I'm up here working my butt off, training. And there was a man in the back who was sound asleep. And I tried not to look at him, tried not to pay attention, but my eyes just kept going there. And the more I kept looking at him, the more aggravated I was getting. I'm up here working my butt off, and you're asleep. Am I that boring? And if I am, fine, but I didn't think I was. And so one thing that I was taught, follow me, one thing I was taught by my mother, who was an educator, was you do not fall asleep in class. Falling asleep in class is disrespectful. That's the message that kept pouring over and over in my head as I'm looking at him sleep in front of me. Imagine him and a student sleeping in front of him. Like, I was having all of these things like, I hope he doesn't write up kids because he is just demonstrating. Like, I was internally still trying to talk like I'm talking to all of you, but having this internal dialogue in my head. And then I wanted to like slam something real loud and like startle him, but I didn't do that. I was trying to be professional. But I was also looking at his colleagues like, y'all just gonna let him sleep? Like, really? But anyway, my point in saying that is that our expectations as staff, educators, teachers, etc., are driven by the things we've been taught are appropriate in school. What my dialogue could have done internally was say, maybe he's not feeling well. Maybe he was up all night, sick child, I don't know. Now, granted, I would have expected him to just get up and take a stretch, but I'm trying to be good and honor the dignity. But my point is that sometimes we as educators have to do that internal dialogue to bring us down from that level of, I want you away from me. I want you out of my class. I want the disrespect to stop. Cultural dissonance. Really quickly, any psychology 101 course will teach you about cognitive dissonance. I'm going to give you an example of cultural dissonance. Let's say you're a teacher, you have a young person in front of you. You continuously say to the young person, look at me when I'm speaking to you, and they remain downcast, eyes downcast. You get more elevated, look at me, look at me. And in their culture, it's disrespectful to look you directly in the eye. A mismatch, dissonance. And then sociodemographics, which we've talked about as well, how those things can really influence, like what neighborhood you're from, what your family does, how that's perceived in the school as well. For time purposes, I'm going to keep moving. I haven't gotten very far, telling too many stories. Okay, chapter 2, where's your bookmark? So let's think of some questions here. What is your current data system? A few of you, I won't say a few, a lot of you raised your hands and said you can disaggregate. So that goes to the second one. Are you able to disaggregate data by subgroup? And if you are, that's phenomenal. The second part B to that question is, who has access to that? I heard some snickers, because that means it's probably locked down, right? How do we make that more available and accessible so people can actually think about how to do things differently? I keep picking on Jason, but he's part of an author group that wrote this book called The Data-Driven School. And in that book, they have moved away from using the term problem solving. And that was a game changer for me. Instead of problem solving, it's needs fulfilling. Needs fulfilling. So that when we can look at this data, we're trying to plug a hole in the need rather than thinking of solving a problem or problematizing what we're seeing in the data. And is there a team to analyze this, or is it just one person who's kind of taking it on? All of these are focus questions for you as we're going through this process. I love this next part. This comes from our friends in Wisconsin. Disaggregating achievement data, which many of you said you can do. Calculating risk ratios, which we'll get to soon. Using root cause analysis, so breaking down the why. So I have another colleague that always says, be a proverbial toddler and say, why? Anytime you're looking at the data. If you can recognize that there's disproportionate representation in, let's say, advanced placement or special education, or identifying who is or isn't present at PTO, PTA events, are all examples of how schools can begin the work of the equity journey. Remember I said sometimes there's indicators that point you towards, we gotta do something different. Something's just not right. Those things that I just listed are what we would call symptoms of those cultural mismatches that I spoke about earlier. Again, culture is broad. So culture could mean families that are coal miners. Culture could mean, I'm just using examples. So those mismatches still occur from middle class to folks that are socioeconomically disadvantaged. All of those things are mismatches that can easily happen in our settings. The problem-solving process, for some of you, you're probably familiar with this process already, so I'm not going to belabor it, but you start with the identification of the need at step 1, calculating some metrics. So just how bad is it? Or how good is it? And what can we do to make sure we keep it on the good path? And then compare that to a goal that you're setting. Number 2 is to analyze and ask yourself, why is what we're seeing happening? So this may be assessing your fidelity, as we know the TFI for our PBISers in the room. Identifying our vulnerable decision points. What are the things that the sleeping man, think of that example. What are the things that trigger me? My vulnerable decision points, the things that make me react very quickly. And then assess our opportunity gap. That might be the reason we're seeing some of these outcomes. Step 3 is, as a result of us now knowing the why, what should we do? So if our TFI is like a 50%, and I know in PAs it's still 70 or 80? 70, okay. We want 70% for fidelity. If it's 50%, where are we missing something? What can we do better? Is there a lack of student engagement? Are we doing those walkthroughs in classrooms and figuring out why there might be a bunch of students sleeping in class? What's going on? And is disproportionality across all settings or just some? For instance, the cafeteria can be a hotbed for disproportionality. Know why? Because there's so much going on. So many different staff members are monitoring that space. They may or may not have familiarity with the students, and they're writing them up because they don't know them well. But they see a behavior and they're writing it up, and it just consistently happens in a cycle. And then the plan. Once we put something new in place to try to rectify what we're seeing, is it working? And that talks about monthly looking at the plan and the progress or lack thereof, quarterly risk ratios, knowing, have we seen some dramatic changes, refining the plan or sharing, and sharing the results with vested partners. This is a math lesson. I'm going to be honest, it is not my forte. However, I do want you to know that these calculations can be done without hand calculation. You can actually get these on different systems and they'll calculate them for you. Excel spreadsheets will do this for you as well. But I wanted you to have a depiction of an example of how to calculate a risk ratio. So there's 2 metrics that you can look at. The risk index is one. And that's the probability of a certain group receiving an outcome, right? The risk ratio then compares that group to all other students and determines the level of risk, almost like the predictability of how many times more likely something will happen, okay? So in this example, we have at the top 10 African American students, 5 with at least 1 referral. Compared to every other student in the school, not just our white students, not just our Latino students, every other student that does not identify as African American, that number, 20 students, there are 10 with at least 1 referral, okay? So the African American students who received at least 1 referral is 5, and for the bottom row, it's 10. So what we see is that 50% of our African American students are at risk of receiving a referral. In the bottom, The same equation ends up being 50% for all other students. What does that equal when we take 50% by 50%? 1.0, which says they're about equal risk. What do we see in reality? Because this is a nice Pollyanna example. The reality is you see things like 3.0. What does that mean translated? African American students are 3 times more likely to receive an office discipline referral than all other students in that school. Transparent moment. My child was beginning kindergarten this year. I had to make a decision on where I was going to send him. When I looked at different resources in education, we know too much sometimes. Different resources, different websites, I was able to look at my child's home school and get a sense of what was considered disproportionate discipline. Not naming the school. If my son, who's a black boy, walked in with his friend, who he now has a little friend named Clay, his little best friend already, who happens to be white, the 2 of them happened to walk into that school together, my son was 7.5 times more likely to receive an office discipline referral or a suspension compared to his best friend Clay. Sit with that for a minute. Imagine if that's your child, and simply because he looks like me, it goes up that significantly. I could cry thinking about it. I wasn't having it. But I had a choice. A lot of our families don't have a choice. And that's where we come in, and why disaggregating data is so valuable, because it will tell the story that needs to be told so that we can do better for everybody's child. Okay? Didn't mean to get somber, but I had to get real with y'all for a minute. I don't want you falling asleep on me. Okay, so chapter 3, do you have a highlighter? Remember, we're still in the book, and I am sweating up here. It's hot. I'm sorry. If you see me like wiping, I don't mean to like look crazy. Okay, the data. So get your highlighters if you have one, and this is proverbial, but you need to think about 4 different things as it relates to data. Demographics, perceptual data, school process data, and student learning data. And what's cool, that Equitable Practices Hub that I talked about earlier, the data practices pillar, if you go there, the resources are organized by those 4 categories. Okay? So if you need like support on, what does she mean by demographic and what can I really do about that? There are resources dedicated to it, multiple measures of data. I'm going to break down each one really fast. With demographics, we're looking at variables like ethnicity, socioeconomic status, things that we know really represent demographics. What we also have to think about is that these are driven by local factors. Remember, I talked about school boards, think about your county, think about all those things. Employment rates drive this. Migration patterns drive this. Population density drive this, and local political decisions. What do I mean by that? So let's think about your own school district, and some of you may not have had this experience. When I went to school, we did. We had something called zoning. And so sometimes a school board or an entity would determine boundaries within the school district of where certain buildings and students would go by their neighborhood. And I have to be honest with all of you, when I shared the story about my son and his choice of school and where he would have been, it is because of those zoning patterns that have created different schools, have created different schools with different populations purposefully. Just being honest. And so because of that, you see those upticks in discipline as well. And those are local political decisions that have driven a lot of our school systems. Okay, demographically, what are you looking at? Your Future Ready Index will give you that demographic data. PIMS, I know that might be a 4-letter word to some of you too. Early warning systems will do that. And then Penn data as well. And if you were in Dr. Peterson's session, he showed you exactly what Penn data looks like the screenshot. So that's definitely a resource, particularly as it relates to students with IEPs. What does perceptual data? So remember, demographics, perceptual was the next one. This really talks about how families, communities, partners, I try to stay away from the term stakeholders, but how partners in your community are looking at instruction, their own beliefs about education, how school life is for them. Do they feel like their child belongs there? Is there a connection? And the beliefs of those partners are typically gathered through surveys. So if you have a survey that goes out to families or even to communities, when that data comes back, what do you do with it? That's a big question. And then how do you make sure that the people who participated know that you're using what they said in a way that's valuable? And so here are some examples as well. The PA School Climate Survey is available. The PAYS, how many of you have given the PAYS or participated in the PAYS? Awesome. If you have not been a district that has participated in PAYS, and I probably am speaking for those that raised their hand, please do. It's going to give you a plethora of information that will really, really dive deep into the climate of your school and how students are feeling as a member of your school community. But it also ties into mental health of your youth, suicidal ideation, drug, alcohol abuse. It gets deep. It's given every 2 years on odd numbered years. So 23 would have been a year. 25 will be the next one. But if you were to go and just simply Google PAYS, you can find a lot of things dedicated to that and insight as to whether or not you can participate. Student engagement instrument, I'm looking at Laura, Check and Connect still has that, I believe. Yeah, so the Check and Connect intervention, if you were to go to that website, the student engagement instrument is quick, easy. It's another way of really assessing how students are feeling in the classroom. For those that are PBISers, the self-assessment survey is there, and I think a brand new version of that actually was just released, so definitely take advantage. And then any belonging or equity surveys are going to give you a lot of rich and robust information. One thing that I often recommend in the 10 minutes that I have remaining are listening sessions. How many of you have conducted those? They're not easy to do. So I'm not surprised by that. What I want to do in the slides that I'm going to highlight is give you some tools if that's something you decide to do. Surveys are one thing. They can be very quantitative. You can put open-ended questions to get some qualitative data in them too. But sometimes it's the stories that make the difference. Remember I said I like telling stories because people connect to them? Because I'm sure if I see one of you later on today, there's something you're going to remember that I said in a story, and you're going to go, that's that woman who talked about that man, sleep. It's going to happen. You see, I can't let it go. I'm trying. But in listening sessions, you want to ask some key questions and really just literally sit and listen, which is hard. So what I've tried to encourage superintendents I work with, if they do this, try to bring in some people that aren't you or your staff, if you have the ability to. Because sometimes, and we're human, it's hard to hear some of the things that you might hear in a listening session, and you want to be so quick to respond, and you got to just pause. So a couple questions if you're doing a student one, for instance. What's going well in school for you right now? What's something you're proud of? What's your biggest challenge? What changes would you like to see in your school? It's funny, I did this in a school district out in the eastern part of our state, and when I asked the students at the middle school, all they focused on was the cafeteria food. I was like, that's fine, that's your reality, that's your truth. Let's keep moving. What feedback do you have for me? In this case, it would be for the school, to make our school a place where people feel like they belong. Very simple, 4 questions. You don't have to ask a ton because sometimes their dialogue will prompt you to ask your own follow-up questions, but these can be your anchors. If you're working with families, it's very similar. What's going well for your child? What's something you feel proud of? What's your biggest frustration or challenge about their school experience? This is the one I love. What should we know about your beliefs, values, and or culture to best support your family and your child? In surveys, we made this an open-ended question so that they could go to town and tell us what we needed to know. And then what feedback do you have for me or the school to improve your child's experience? Okay, can't forget the staff. If you're doing listening sessions with students, You also want to do it with staff. Here are some questions to consider. What's something in your practice you're feeling good about or proud of right now? What's frustrating you or keeping you up at night? What is one critical change you'd like to see in our school culture, our systems, or our structures? And then what feedback do you have for me as a leader or a colleague to support creating our school as a place where all can experience belonging? Again, simple 4 questions. You may be prompted to add more as you move through it, but staff want to know they're feeling heard too. It's so important for them to have that sense of value because they're in the trenches every day, having to navigate a whole heck of a lot. Give it everybody a minute, okay. For processes, this is pretty simple. We're talking about structures and routines, what courses are offered, turnover rates, that's data. That's important data around teachers, administrators, et cetera. What is your typical class size? Process data. This can also speak to curriculum instruction and assessment. And I just offered some examples here. Code of conduct, comprehensive plans. That's always a fun process, isn't it? Student enrollment, and I don't want to neglect extracurriculars because sometimes that can be an access and opportunity equity question as well. Number of students receiving remediation, tutoring, or enrichment, our MTSS or PBIS manuals, policies around discipline, and attendance. For student learning, this is the 4th and final multiple measure of data. We're talking about things like PSSAs, et cetera, grade point averages, standards assessments, and then authentic assessments. So those local assessments that you give consistently just to see if things are working or not. And here are the examples here. I gave some already. PASA, Keystone, PBIS, progress monitoring. Okay, we made it to chapter 4 with a few minutes left. All right, chapter 4, conclusion. So with the data chat, so now that we know what types of data we can be looking at, and the reason I took you through that is because sometimes I know what I used to think data was just some numbers and some graphs. I hope that this has expanded your repertoire of what data can be and how it can inform what you do. So when you're sitting around kind of analyzing all of that, are our conversations upward or downward? What do I mean by that? Let me give you an example. This may be hard to see, so I'm going to try to read it out. A downward spiral example is as follows. Teacher 1 says, wow, our reading scores are really low this year. Another teacher says, I know, right? I still think if we would have looked at our zoning, many of the students who were the lowest should be at that other school anyway. Okay? Next teacher says, I agree. I don't know why we get blamed for the fact that their parents don't care. Many are in jail and we're just supposed to fix everything. Sound familiar? Mm-hmm. And the next teacher says, I heard a parent say that they wished our school was back to the way it used to be before we just allowed anyone to attend here. Okay, that's a downward spiral. Why? Because there's nothing that will get solved in that conversation. You're just spiraling. Okay? Upward spiral. Starting over. Wow, our reading scores are really low this year. Other teacher, yes, I saw that. I'm really trying to think of what we could have done differently with our students in tier 2 who seem to make the least amount of growth. Next teacher, I noticed that when we would review the data, we sometimes would focus mainly on our students receiving tier 3 and made some assumptions about the progress of the other students. And the last person says, we probably need to check in more with our tier 2 systems team to see how the interventions were matching the need. I'm going to schedule time to meet with the tier 2 team leader next week to discuss. What do you see in that? Action. Something's going to happen. That's the difference between an upward spiral and a downward spiral. So when you have all of that data, you disaggregate that data, you start to see some things that you don't like necessarily. What can we talk about? How can we talk about it? Some ways to interrupt some downward spiral conversations is a 4-step process that if I had time, I would go through each one in depth. But I would encourage you, if you've not seen this before, to go to learningforjustice.org. At learningforjustice.org, there's a whole section called Speak Up to Bias. And they provide you 4 steps. One is to interrupt. So when that oh, if they, their parents don't care. As soon as that's said, there should be an immediate interruption. What does that sound like? It may be, thanks, Nancy, for identifying, how you're thinking about how the parents are responding. We really got to keep moving. We only have 10 minutes of our meeting left. They might be a little ticked at you, but that just needs to be a hill you're willing to die on, because you're not going to solve anything by problematizing a family. Question. So after you interrupt, you can question, if you have time. What did you mean by that? Help me understand. Okay? The third one is, these are in the wrong order, I'm sorry. The third one should be educate. So it should go interrupt, question, educate. So in educate, when the person says, their dad's in jail and they don't care, the education part would be, I've worked with a lot of students who are children of incarcerated parents, and that has not always been my experience, that they don't care. Right? You're educating. Minor way of just kind of changing the narrative. And then the fourth one, it's out of sync, is echo. And ideally, you'll have a partner in that space who will just reiterate what you said. And it doesn't have to be a big deal, but Eva, for instance, I always see her as a partner. If we're in a room, she's going to be my echo, or I'm going to be hers. And we've already made that bond. So when it comes up, I know if I say something, she's going to back me. I hate to say this, you may have to have some meetings before the meetings for some of these meeting monsters who show up and basically derail your whole meeting. Okay, George Bash, who is presenting here at the same time as me, which is crazy to think about, and you probably wish you would have gone to see him, but I think he's on again later today. He says that equity is access, equity is process, and equity is outcomes. And that's what we mean about access simply not being enough. We have to know whether or not the access we provided is actually working. That's the process piece. And then the outcomes are literally that. Have we seen the impact we were hoping for? For sake of time, I'm going to keep moving, but I want us to ask ourselves a couple questions. What's your story? What's our story? Do we need to review some chapters? And if you have my slide deck, you'll get the slides I didn't get to go in depth around. Are characters missing? Are there voices we have not tapped into? And then what are our book reviews? Did Amazon say we're 5-star? Or are we at 1 and we really need to think about improving? We got to do that self-assessment. And so with that, because I want to honor your time, you can connect with me. I still call it Twitter. It's X now. But if you want to connect with me, you're more than welcome to do so. I love to have Twitter friends and LinkedIn as well. I also have a website. And as Dr. Allen said, I will be having my book at one of the tables out front this afternoon during lunch. So come pay me a visit if you like. Thank you all so much for your time.